got black, I got white, what you want? Hop outside a ghost and hop up in a fan.
Time period takes place in the 1700s. After the French and Indian War, which kicks off this whole time period, the British were in massive debt. Because of this, Britain tightens their control over the colonies by enforcing the Navigation Acts, which they used to not enforce at all. Look at Nate with the camera back. So extended their wartime policy of quartering soldiers within the private homes with the Quartering Act of 1765, and they also started to tax the colonists to collect their money, fix their debt, and this was also a direct tax, which was all done to mainly deal with their debt.
The concept of no taxation without representation was a valid and just movement for many reasons. Right now in particular, we will glance at the concept of virtual representation.
21?
You stupid!
Virtual representation was the idea that members of Parliament, including the Lords and the Crown in Parliament, reserved the right to speak for the interests of all British subjects. However, the colonists were not granted this. Politically and geographically speaking, they were divided significantly from England. Virtual representation was essentially unavailable to them, especially since they didn't actually have anybody there representing them. This shows that the concept of no taxation without representation is a valid and just movement because the colonists were being forced to pay such harsh tax in response to English debt, whilst not having anybody within Parliament to genuinely represent them. America is politically isolated from England, and it's nothing but unjust and ignorant to treat them as normal English citizens, despite them not being in English to actually voice their concerns. An example of this is the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts passed in 1767. These acts taxed goods imported to the Americas colonies, such as British china, glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The colonists saw this as an abuse of power since they had no representation in Parliament. Parliament. The concept of virtual representation is being used illegitimately because they aren't being represented, and it's illogical to view it in any other way. Thank you for
Alright, with that being said, are there any objections from the colonists? Boy, you don't shut.
The British Parliament passed the Tea Act in 1773, which made the price of tea, even with the tax included, cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea. The British passed this act in order to help the East India Company out with their severe financial problems. But once again, the colonists were not happy since they were being taxed without representation. The colonists had no representatives in Parliament to consent or oppose British actions, so the British just kept making new acts whether the colonists liked it or not. But even with the cheaper tea, many Americans still refused to buy it because if they did, they'll recognize Parliament's right to tax them. This was the colonists' way of boycotting British goods. This situation then escalated further in December of 1773, the incident also known as the Boston Tea Party.
We don't want no taxes. What we do want is representation. Representation.
Now we'll get into the Stamp Act of 1765. It was established by Lord Grenville, the current Prime Minister of Britain, along with the Parliament. They would establish the Stamp Act in 1765, like I just said. The main thing to understand and note is that this act was established against all 13 colonies. And it's important to understand that when this act was established, those 13 colonies had no representation at all. They had no representatives representing their wants and desires and had no ability to accept or reject the act as it was being established. Now the British were establishing the Stamp Act in order to pay off their debt that they got from the French and Indian War. They got way too cocky during that war, and as a result, they put themselves into massive debt. So what do? They target the 13 colonies, they tax them, they collect more and more money from them to try to pay off their debt as fast as they can, and they also use that money to support their military power as well. Now, the Stamp Act had revenue stamps that were put on a majority of printed paper. This included legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, and advertisements. This was one of the first direct tax on all 13 colonies. Keep in mind, the Stamp Act was targeted against the 13 colonies, and they had no representation, no opinions, and no ability to accept or reject this specific act. Now, this ties to the statement of no taxation without representation. The taxes from the Stamp Act interfered financially with the colonies and the colonists, and they had no ability and had no say within that matter. No representation. The colonists were angered from the Stamp Act. They had no representation in enabling the act, and that's where we get Patrick Henry, a young Virginia lawyer who goes to the House of Burgesses in Virginia and stands up, demanding to the king's government to recognize their right, specifically the right for the colonists to not get taxed without representation. That is exactly what happened. The Stamp Act put revenue stamps on printed paper and taxes on paper, and the colonists had no ability, no representation, no representatives to go out there and say no, yes, or share any thoughts or opinions or how they felt about the act before it got established. This makes their statement of no taxation without representation valid because this is literally what happened. The taxes from the Stamp Act went against the colonies, and the colonies had no representation and no ability to say no to that act. Therefore, there was no way for them to stop that act. No taxation without